I'll be relatively brief. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Wayne Castonguay. I'm the director of the Ipswich River Watershed Association, and you heard from Chris Hilke before me. We were a partner in this planning effort. I do want to give a shout out. A lot of the themes today were about partnerships, and as Chris indicated, this has been an incredible exemplification of people coming together to a common cause. This planning effort, although Ipswich River and National Wildlife Federation was sort of the ringleaders, it was really the towns who did the heavy lifting and the municipal task force. The 6 towns shown here on the slide, Salisbury to Essex, really rolled up their sleeves, and they're the ones that decided and came up with the recommendations that we're going to talk about. I also have to say, for those of you in Gloucester in the crowd, why not Gloucester? Gloucester's part of the Great Marsh. The reason for that is, no, a shout out to you guys, because you guys were actually a year ahead of us. And you already went off and did your own plans, so we actually emulated Gloucester, who really kicked off a lot of this effort in the Great Marsh. So just real quickly, as we heard earlier from Katie, we're really fortunate here in the Great Marsh to have the national leaders in the climate resiliency movement participate. Obviously, the National Wildlife Federation, who brought all this great work to our region, they are national leaders in this great work, as is the Nature Conservancy. And I like to steal this slide from them because it really simply exemplifies the process that Chris really outlined in just a couple of steps. As Chris indicated, we started with assessing our vulnerabilities. This is where we're at now, is identifying the solutions, but I hate the word solution because that denotes that you've solved the problem. This kind of work, you can never actually solve it. So in our world, we use the term adaptation and strategies, which you'll hear from here on out. And I only put this up really to emphasize the next step is to take action, and our goal today is to set the stage for that action. So all of this afternoon is designed around the next steps or implementation, or in the planning world, so this plan does not sit on a shelf. So this is the strategy and adaptation identification process that NWF uses nationally that we adopted here. And so we came up with 4 buckets of solutions or adaptation strategies. And I'm really just going to focus on the nature-based. And this plan is big and extensive, and there are literally hundreds of recommendations. I'm here to really try to make the case why protecting the Great Marsh is our #1 strategy. You saw this slide, those of you who came last year. What we did is we broke up the 4 buckets of strategies, and we basically combed the country for ideas to line up with our identified problems here in the Great Marsh. And NWF came up with this great matrix of ideas to pull from around the country for solutions or adaptation strategies that you all saw last year. This is extracted from the actual plan, and we have basically 2 categories of adaptation strategies. One is the regional strategies here, and there are 5 categories there. I'm only going to be focusing on 2 of these, the nature-based strategies and then the land use planning and policy, which you municipal officials in the room will hear a lot more about. And then finally, the second category of strategies were the town-specific strategies that Chris mentioned earlier. And those were presented at last year's symposium for those of you who were here. And we literally, I didn't count them up, but there were probably on the order of 400 specific assets that the community members identified that they were concerned about, that we tailor-made adaptation strategies for those. So those will also be in the plan. But again, I'm only going to focus on the nature-based strategies. So this is a matrix that explains what we mean by nature-based strategies. And I'm going to use that one term to combine natural and nature-based, which are hybrid strategies that Chris mentioned. And this graphic really describes it all. On the top, we have all of the different categories of strategies, nature-based. Here are all of the data or information or that big spreadsheet I showed earlier. So you basically identify your risks and vulnerabilities and then try to find solutions that mostly we gather from other places. And then here's the tricky part, the societal challenges. So we're going to put out a whole list of recommendations to the towns, then politics and people come into play. And that's really where things get interesting, and hopefully we'll talk all about that this afternoon. And then at the outcome, at the bottom of that, you have two outcomes if we've done our job right. One is human well-being, basically risk aversion or protecting human societies, but also biodiversity or natural benefits. And in our business, you hear this, there's a lot of lingo going around. These are what we call co-benefits. It's only really going to be sustainable and productive if you really have an outcome that does both of those things, enhances the natural community and provides community well-being. So again, we really looked at the recommendations through that lens. So I don't have to tell this room what I'm about to say, but I just really want to emphasize this point. We know that natural systems and healthy ecosystems really help reduce community risk. I think seeing all of you here, intuitively we know that, but I just want to really emphasize that because I think it's critical to supporting the conclusion that we're going to make that protecting the Great Marsh is our #1 defense. First of all, wetlands really do reduce risk. We, as Chris indicated, were funded by the Hurricane Sandy grant program. That same study determined that healthy wetlands reduced damages by over $600 million during Hurricane Sandy. And those damages were directly related to the health of those wetlands. The healthier the marsh or the wetland, the more damage prevention it occurs, and vice versa. Unhealthy marshes do very little in terms of risk reduction. And then secondly, this slide that the TNC put together, they did a national study of storms and damages across the country, and they came up with this graph. On the left are the cost benefits, so the higher the bar graph here, the more positive those benefits were, and along the bottom here are the damages averted. And the two categories of strategies, nature-based, which of course are green, and then traditional strategies, which are blue, which are things like seawalls and hard structures. And almost across the board, they found that the nature-based strategies had a much higher cost-benefit ratio. And conversely, the traditional strategies, where we spend our millions and billions, have almost no cost-benefit. In fact, they have less benefit than cost. So this really says it all. Nature-based strategies are really our #1 line of defense. And folks ask why this one outlier here, the most cost-benefit strategy across the board, is sandbagging. But everything else we do costs us more than we gain. So it's really a case closed that natural resource protection is our #1 defense. This is a slide that I created myself. We talk about risk a lot these days across our society. With regard to climate risk, this new term that we're starting to hear, increasing our natural security, I don't really like that, but it really is apropos to today, is that's what we really have to strive to do across the Great Marsh region. And these 3 bullets, in my mind, say it all. The first, we have to protect our natural habitats. As I see it, we have to stop messing things up. That's our #1 job, because nature will protect us if we let it do it itself. And then, where we have messed up things, we have to restore those so they can function naturally. This is the area where we'll probably be spending most of our money to fix things that we've previously messed up. And then thirdly, we in our human society build things, and we need to live, and we need lots of infrastructure to survive and carry on our economy and our everyday lives. What we need to do increasingly is mimic nature in our developed landscapes, because nature knows how to do all these things. We've for years been building these structures and our societies without regard to natural cycles. We have to mimic those natural cycles in our built environment. We often think of that as in terms of new development, but here in the Great Marsh and across the country where our environment is already built up, it's retrofits and redevelopment where we really have the opportunity to make change. So I just want to emphasize and set the stage how our nature-based strategies fit into this larger picture. Chris and others really emphasized the importance of partnerships, and I want to do that again here. To come up with these natural solutions that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, we convened virtually every natural resource professional working in the Great Marsh, and we looked at every plan that has been produced over a period of decades in the Great Marsh. We are incredibly fortunate here that we have this incredible array of experts and prior planning to inform our future work. These 21 entities came together and were our inside experts and our technical experts throughout this planning process. We even had a full-day workshop with all 21 of these folks in the room that really looked at all of our threats, all of our vulnerabilities, and then that bucket of solutions to really fine-tune those into specific measures that will reduce our risk in the Great Marsh. So again, many of you, those 21 entities are in this room, and for you municipal officials, look to those folks as we move forward to really help inform what we do. Katie and Chris talked a lot about natural defenses. We all know inherently, as I said, that nature is our #1 defense. These are some categories that we looked at. Salt marshes, of course, are incredibly valuable, and we're fortunate here to have a relatively intact salt marsh. Beaches and dunes are really our coastal armoring. Also, what was really surprising, at least to me during our planning process, is the importance of rivers and streams and freshwater systems. We often think of sea level rise and coastal storms as our biggest threat here in the Great Marsh, but when we met with the municipalities, freshwater flooding was actually a bigger concern. So we have to look at freshwater flooding in the same way we look at sea level rise. And then finally, the importance of biodiversity. We often think of these natural systems as physical things, but biodiversity is actually the key. The more diverse a biological system is, the more resilient it is, and the quicker we can recover from these storm events. So protecting a healthy, biodiverse system is as important as protecting our barrier beach. So the natural strategies in the plan, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of them just to give you a little flavor, because there are so many. There are literally hundreds in the plan. So I'm just going to touch on a few of those. We talked about these already this morning, things like invasive species, and I won't talk about green crabs because everyone else has done that. But dune restoration, salt marsh restoration, and restoring connectivity wherever we've put man-made structures in the way of flow and natural hydrologic processes is really, really significant. Chris showed this bigger table in his presentation. As I said earlier, I'm going to be focusing on two categories, nature-based and policy. So this is the table right from the plan that has the higher level categories under which the individual specific recommendations live. And you can see the array of things that we're talking about. Using living shorelines, restore vegetation, facilitate marsh migration. So Great Marsh barrier assessment, Chris mentioned this earlier. Barriers basically are in another lexicon or part of our lingo that means any man-made structure that intercepts flows. Things like bridges, dams, seawalls, breakwaters. As Chris indicated, we inventoried every one in the Great Marsh, including the entire watershed. One of the things during this planning process is the Great Marsh depends on its entire watershed for its health. So way up here in Burlington, the Great Marsh watershed begins behind the Burlington Mall on 128. We have to really think about things as far away as Burlington in terms of how we create and support a resilient Great Marsh. We also did a lot with dune restoration as well. One of the things that came out of the planning process is we only have to do dune restoration in our developed barrier islands. We're incredibly fortunate here that most of our barrier islands are protected from development and are really self-resilient. In fact, when we get these coastal storms, they're free from development so they can recover naturally. Our goal in this plan is to make that the same on our developed barrier beaches between Newbury and Salisbury. The third category of nature-based strategies that I'd like to emphasize is land conservation. Senator O'Connor Ives talked a lot about land conservation in her remarks. And land conservation, in my mind, is the #1 nature-based strategy that we can employ, because protected landscapes do two things for us. One, obviously, you can no longer damage the environment if we don't build and use them. But secondly, on protected landscapes, we have the most opportunity for biodiversity and natural systems to thrive. A big part of this planning effort were to identify the most important unprotected lands for land conservation to work on. Some of these that the communities recommended are shown here. And one of the things we did is actually developed a model where we can assess the importance and the relative importance of each piece of property that were identified against each other. And so this is a really important part of the plan. And we're just super fortunate to have a large array of land conservation efforts in this region. Trustees, Greenbelt, Audubon, and our cities and towns who really focus on this, and it's a critical part of our plan. The other category of strategies that I want to emphasize are policy strategies, and I see so many municipal officials here in the room. In Massachusetts, we're fairly unique across the country in that our individual cities and towns control most of the things that can affect nature in our state. And policy decisions are by far and away the most important category in my mind, because fixing nature is hard and expensive. Restoring these natural systems is quite expensive and long-term. Prevention is the #1 solution. We hear that with a lot of society's problems, and it's very much the case with natural resource decision-making. So municipal officials really have the fate of the Great Marsh in their hands. And I'm not really referring to the staff and the elected officials as much as I am to the volunteers that run our cities and towns committees and boards. So it's all of us collectively that really have a lot to say. I want to just add a quick anecdote from my own personal experience. Resources always come up when we talk about policy changes and changing bylaws and property rights. These are our big hurdles that we have to overcome when we're talking about improving nature and our natural resources. I was on my town's stormwater committee, and we realized that we really didn't spend much time regulating stormwater, and stormwater is one of the biggest threats we have to our natural environments, as we all know. It exacerbates flooding. It's the #1 source of pollution facing the Great Marsh. And our resources are increasingly stretched in our cities and towns. And increasingly, we're really going to have to find those resources from existing resources, and we're just going to have to internally in our communities make hard choices. And the anecdote I want to share is our stormwater committee realized we were investing more resources in our town on regulating garden sheds than we were stormwater. So just make those choices is something we're increasingly going to have to do because financial resources are stretched. So a couple of specific ideas in the policy realm. This is the chapter on policy in the plan and the categories that we have to fall under. You know, simple things like move development away from vulnerable areas, create incentives. Unfortunately, in Massachusetts, we can't, at the local level, enact stricter builder codes. So we have to incentivize the things we want to do in a large degree. And I'm going to highlight 3 of these categories in a minute. So the one thing that I said earlier that we can do more than anything else is mimic nature in our developed landscapes. And because there's less and less new development over time, we increasingly have to focus on redevelopment. Another lexicon in our business is what we call LID, or low impact development, or another term, climate smart development. We really have to institute these measures as our primary way that we regulate development. Right now it's optional or secondary, but we have to go through all of our zoning bylaws, all of our planning board regulations, all of our Concom regs, and really switch this dynamic and make LID the norm and not the exception. And in fact, we have to make LID mandatory as opposed to things like wide roads and storm drains and sidewalks, which a lot of our bylaws require now. We also have to make individual choices because what every one of us does on our individual properties can make a huge difference. Things like installing rain gardens and drought-resisting landscapes. All of those measures are individual decisions which collectively add up to a huge impact. Things like permeable pavement and eliminating runoff from developed areas should be our goal and is totally within our grasp. As I said earlier, revising local bylaws and regulations is a key part of this. Everybody hates regulation. However, it should not be our right to impact the environment because we all dependent on that. And we as municipal officials have to increasingly recognize that we need some regulations to protect the greater whole, particularly with regard to nature, which is our #1 defense. I just want to call out a couple examples. In our area, Rowley has this incredible floodplain protection bylaw, incredibly forward-looking and progressive, and they go well beyond what's required. If we were simply to address that or adopt that floodplain bylaw across all 6 communities, we would have a tremendous difference. When we went through the planning process with our municipal task forces, Rowley would always come to the meetings and said, "We've done that. We don't need to do that. We're already resilient." And Rowley is really, in a lot of ways, ahead of the curve. For one, their barrier beach, Plum Island, doesn't have a single building on it. So they're pretty fortunate there. Their town center is elevated well away from the marsh. After the Mother's Day flood, which was a 500-year flood in 2006, they basically upgraded almost all of their bridges and culverts. So now their culverts are no longer flooding. So they're pretty progressive. On the other hand, we always tell them, well, you haven't done this, this, and this. But we can learn from each other is the bottom line. Another example is the Ipswich Wetlands Protection Bylaw. They have a suite of regulations for the ACEC, which is an acronym for the Area of Critical Environmental Concern, that they've essentially set up a pseudo-zoning district along the edge of the Great Marsh where there's an extra layer of regulation to keep development and impact away from the marsh, and as sea level rises, allow the Great Marsh to move and migrate inland. Incredibly progressive. To put a face on that, there are 2 places in the Great Marsh where you could paddle or walk out in the Great Marsh and not see any sign of humanity, if you can believe it. The Upper Rowley River, the Egypt River, and Labor and Vein Creek. If you go out in these places, you can't see any sign of humans. And a big part of that is the shoreline zoning in Ipswich, some of the wild places in the whole southern New England. So these things can be done. We have great examples amongst our peers. And if we were just to take the best that each of the 6 communities have already done and apply those across the board, we can have incredible change. One last example of policy, way down in the weeds, but I think it exemplifies the point. One of our big recommendations is to implement what's called comprehensive water resources management in our communities. Right now, water is managed in silos. That term came up earlier. The water department withdraws water from the environment without talking to the wastewater and sewer department, without talking to the planning board. And what we need to do in our towns is integrate all of those silos and integrate water management because it has an incredible impact. This is just one example of that. Scientists have discovered the #1 threat to salt marsh, more a threat right now than sea level rise, is nitrogen. For those of you who don't know it, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient in coastal environments. In freshwater, it's phosphorus, but nitrogen is a limiting nutrient in the marine environment. All of biology operates based on the limited amount of nitrogen in the marine environment. Dr. Linda Deegan of MBL and the LTER did a groundbreaking study in the Rowley Marsh that basically determined that nitrogen, because it's basically limiting, it feeds the decomposers. So the bacteria and yeast that decay everything in the environment really depend on that nitrogen. And excess nitrogen is the largest thing responsible for the decay of our salt marshes and peat. Up and down the eastern seaboard, we've all heard that marshes are not keeping up with sea level rise. and are actually decaying, and nitrogen is the leading source of that. And so one of the recommendations in our plan is to go after the sources of nitrogen throughout the Great Marsh. These red dots are some of the biggest sources. Most of them tend to be our wastewater treatment plants. Several of our communities have sewage plants. We also have some private sewage plants. And then the other big source of nitrogen in the Great Marsh are communities or neighborhoods still on septic systems, particularly older septic systems on poor soils. And so these dots are the hot spots that we really have to go after to fix the nitrogen problem. Finally, I just want to wind down with another thought. Chris showed that the plan. This plan is going to be online through basically links on all of our websites. This is our project-based website that we can go on today for one, but it's going to be on NWF's website as well as the Great Marsh Coalition websites. Melissa, who's going to talk right after lunch, just assured me that it'll be up in about 2 weeks, hopefully sooner. So it's going to be out there, and this is something we hope won't sit on the shelf. Just want to end with a couple of observations that I have personally. It was great to hear this morning from the senator that climate change, at least in Massachusetts, isn't a question anymore, and that seems to be the case. I mean, just think about it. Just in the last couple of decades, we've had several hundred-year storms. Last year was the most impactful drought we've ever had in our history. We can see the Great Marsh flooded much more than it's ever been. Last year, Crane Beach, during a really hot summer day, actually had to close because people couldn't get there because their road was flooded for the first time in a non-storm event. And we see this when we drive across the marsh all the time. Just last week, we had just your average rainstorm that had almost hurricane-force winds and closed schools for 2 or 3 days, more than most nor'easters and hurricanes when they come through. These events are happening, and it's happening fast and more quickly than even we were predicting a few years ago. So on the one hand, we have real evidence. We can see it happening before our eyes. On the other hand, we haven't caught up in the way we run our towns and business. Right now, we're still messing things up. Right now, we're still allowing development to occur in the traditional ways. So we really have to balance those things out. And it doesn't have to be expensive. Virtually, a lot of these recommendations are free. We just simply have to change the way of doing business, as Chris really emphasized at the close. We have to have a new paradigm the way we think about these things. This plan really is the roadmap for us to do this. And with this in hand now, it's time to get to work, and this afternoon we hope to really involve all of you in preventing this from sitting on a shelf. So with that, I'll close, but I want to open it up to questions. Any questions? Yes? No, a large amount of the Great Marsh, all of the Annisquam River, and a lot of people don't know that Essex Bay actually is owned by 3 communities, including Gloucester, so Gloucester has a tremendous portion of the Great Marsh. Can you speak up? Yeah, so the question was, how do farms contribute here? Farms, like every sort of activity that humans do, has some impact. In our area, we're fortunate that we do have a lot of farms. In terms of nitrogen, we are fortunate in that the farms we have are diversified vegetable operations, and they don't necessarily require a lot of additional nitrogen. Nitrogen is a super problem in the mid-Atlantic and the southeast due to livestock agriculture. Here, we're fortunate that we don't have a lot of livestock agriculture. Also, one of the remarkable conclusions, at least to me, of the MBL study that I referenced in Raleigh, is that our rivers, which across the country are usually the #1 source of nitrogen to coastal areas, our rivers here in the Great Marsh are not contributing great sources of nitrogen. And the processes in our rivers seem to be taking the nitrogen out of the system before it hits the Great Marsh. So the agricultural inputs, while they might be there, aren't finding their way to the Great Marsh, fortunately. Good question. Yes? The question is nationally, how are our marshes faring? And I don't have a specific answer to that, and maybe someone else will, but across the country, 50% of our marshes are gone entirely. They don't even exist anymore. And beyond that, about 80 to 90% are degraded to some extent. As the questioner indicated, we are really fortunate here that we have a relatively intact marsh, and we have the best opportunity of almost anybody to make it even better and more resilient. So let's take advantage of that. Charlotte? So the question was our sources of nitrogen in the Great Marsh. It's by and large wastewater, either from septic systems and wastewater treatment plants. Two of the recommendations in the plan specifically call for communities to institute septic system management programs, which can reduce the amount of nitrogen if septic systems are properly maintained. And then similarly, we're recommending that the communities explore advanced denitrification of their wastewater treatment plants. The good news, Salisbury, I saw Michelle in the audience, Salisbury's already taken that step. So Salisbury's plant is one of the most progressive in the state, so we're fortunate there. And so over time, the other plants can be brought up and upgraded as well. Jack.
When and how will build summer?
Jack's question is, what about our dry streams? Unfortunately, water management is a big issue, and our cities and towns are the culprits. We withdraw from our rivers and streams locally, and in many cases, we actually dry up those streams during the summer and dry periods. And it's a long process, but the big key in how that fits in here is dry rivers can't function. The biodiversity is really upset, so it really plays a big part of this. And so in the plan, we recommended that term, comprehensive water resources management, and part of that is improved water conservation, and for our cities and towns to work together regionally to share water so we can reduce our impact on our most stressed rivers and streams. Carolyn? So the comment was, what about the other side of the equation about what we are all doing to cause climate change? Our study obviously is how to adapt to climate change, so we're on that side of the equation. But yes, absolutely, I think through these processes we have to talk about the cause as well. It's a good comment. Yes?
Sure that doesn't happen.
So the question is how we make sure that this plan does not sit on a shelf. And the plan has a whole chapter on that question, and so we make recommendations to that. We're also spending the whole afternoon on that very question, but it's our responsibility, those of us who are connected to this issue, those of us who serve on municipal town boards, to keep this live. Carolyn just talked about being at a selectmen's meeting and questioning your officials. That's the way it's going to happen. We recommend that each town keep this process alive through formal task forces, keep those going. Katie talked a lot about the state and how they're going to invest in our local communities to make sure that doesn't happen. But ultimately, it is going to be up to us and all of us trying to keep this alive. The comment in question was really how do we keep everyone's feet to the fire and keep this in front of us. It's really going to take a large-scale community-wide effort to make this issue a higher priority than it is currently. Again, stock answer, sorry, but there's a whole chapter in the plan on community engagement and outreach. We actually say in the plan that is probably one of the most important things, because all of us collectively have to be engaged in this effort, because not only political pressure, not only engagement, but our personal behaviors are a key part of this. So it's really going to take all of us. Yeah, the question is, there were a lot of good things in here that are separate from natural resource protection and climate change, and that's true. A lot of the things, easily half of the recommendations are planning 101, things we extracted from existing plans, things that we've known about for decades and all of us have been working on for decades. So we tried to synthesize a lot of those best management practices under a new lens, and hopefully under that new lens, as this issue becomes higher profile, we'll have a better chance to getting those best practices implemented. Peter? Peter's question is, what about the roadblocks at the state level in terms of regulations that are to protect our natural resources and how they can be an impediment to some of these proactive restoration projects? It's a big issue. I personally think it's less of an issue than a lot of us do. It requires permits, but the state is trying to streamline some of these through their upgraded restoration limited projects, for example, but it is a challenge. If we're trying to fix things, we shouldn't have to go through the same level of process as a developer would. So we've got to work in that area, because not only is it expensive, time-consuming, it's deflating for people who want to do the right thing. So it's a very good comment. Fred? Yeah, so the question was, how much of this is relative to just flooding, both coastal and inland, versus other? You'll be surprised when you do read the plan that there's certainly flooding is a big issue, but there's a whole suite of other issues. What Fred indicated was, what about drought management? There's a lot on water conservation and drought and changing our behaviors. There's a lot on wastewater management and construction. So it really takes quite the whole suite of impacts into account. Bill? Bill's comment was how we can really make it easier to facilitate some of these proactive projects by reducing the regulatory burden that these proactive projects have to go through. And his comment was we needed a system and a group of people to work specifically on that issue, and we definitely would agree with that. Jim? The question was, does the plan go into how do we pay for these things? The plan does, but indirectly. What it does is recommend a lot of structures and processes in the implementation chapter that set up working groups and procedures that then secondarily would have access to funding and whatnot. So it doesn't necessarily list all of the funding sources, but it does recommend that we set up structures in our communities that would have access to funding and the knowledge to connect to that funding. So again, if we all work together, the funding sources will materialize. Jeff. Yeah, so Jeff's question was, at the local level, it's really hard when you start talking about individual rights, property rights, and we need to find a way to offer more carrots than sticks. So it is hard. No one said this is going to be easy, but there are more and more carrots. The plan does talk about a lot of those. One example that Julia just reminded me of is the Coastal Zone Management Resiliency Grants. All of you should apply every year for those. They're great. A lot of you already have. Ipswich, Essex, Newburyport have already started resiliency grant planning through that program. So it's an awesome, awesome resource. And there are more and more of those, as Katie indicated, that we just need to take advantage of.